Webcam microphone up close. Webcam microphone up close.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
But I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? Pistols and the final slap of choice, I don't know, the internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the cartoon comes from, as long as it's real. It's hard to get real information. Because seriously, just reads two sources whenever I try to prove out, it's not. You expect your government to tell you the truth, you're going to sadly disappoint another one of these things.
Dear Lord, what a dirty old man.
Really? Can't be serious. Is this really want things to be? Come on. More hooker, eruptions? Eruptions, whatever.
Like Dave Powers kind of.
Really?
Allegedly broadcast live from Pima Region 2, within the borders of the formerly united and currently occupied states of America. We bring you the Ochelli Effect.
It's like, damn sure, no, I'm an original. We have all these situations. I'd love to know why it takes 50 years, for a 19-year-old girl to eventually get up to gumption to put these things out. Oh my, I think I missed my cue and had a little trouble connecting there. But we are live on UCY Radio. Sorry about that, guys. It's the Ochelli Effect. It's Thursday night. Tonight I have an interesting guest, somebody who I have read before, and I believe that we will have... Let's see what's going on. All right. Well, I got a little weird visual cue coming up in my box there. So, I want to introduce Mr. Douglas Valentine, who is the author. Let me just slow down a second here because I had a little trouble connecting and it just gave me a little trouble. But to accurately describe Mr. Valentine, he's an author, an investigator, and a consultant, and also a poet. Mr. Valentine has authored numerous books, including my favorites, The Phoenix Project, The Strength of the Pack, The Personalities, Politics, and Espionage Intrigues That Shaped the DEA, and The Strength of the Wolf, The Secret History of America's War on Drugs. So, also, the Douglas Valentine Vietnam collection can only be viewed by appointment at the National Security Archives, reading room in Washington, D.C. So just so you know, this is somebody who actually does some very serious, very scholarly research, and to me is one of the best sources on what we're going to discuss today. So, here's the thing. I have a few questions for Mr. Valentine, and first I would just like to say, hello, sir. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Getting older.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all?
Yes, we are.
So we have this entirely large subject, and we're going to try to capsulize it here today. First, I just wonder if you wanted to say anything else about yourself besides what I just covered, your books, your research, and the fact that I feel as though you're one of the best authors as a source for the public on the general war on drugs sort of reality, which is ignored by the mainstream media and just about every other media, in fact. Do you have anything that you'd like to say about that, sir?
Yeah, sure. the United States has stated policy and it has an unstated policy. And when the government speaks to you, it speaks its stated policy, what it wants you to know, and what it wants you to think. And behind the scenes, it has an unstated policy. And if you really want to, what it's really doing, all the things it's really doing, and the reasons that it's really doing things for. And in order to understand what's going on, you have to look past the stated policy and discover the unstated policies, what's going on behind the scenes. And that requires a lot of work. You can't get this information in newspapers. And, you have to go to primary sources. And a lot of people don't have a lot of time to do that. I have devoted 30 years to doing that. So I've got a hold of a lot of information that a lot of people don't have access to. It's difficult to capsulize that information, but I'll do the best I can and try to articulate some of these incredibly complex things in simple terms that might make sense.
Okay, that's wonderful, sir. My first question for you actually is, how does one escape calling the United States drug policy anything but organized crime?
Well, there's some loaded terms in that question. And when you talk about crime, you're inferring the law. And so there's like 2 or 3 things in that question that have to be defined. The first thing is that police, people who enforce the laws, don't obey the laws. They enforce them. And if you're going 100 miles an hour down a highway, a cop can go 100 miles an hour and pull you over and give you a ticket. He doesn't break the law for going 100 miles an hour. And so when you talk about crime and law enforcement, the relationship gets very blurred. Everything that law enforcement does, in a sense, is breaking the laws that they are required to enforce. So you have to be very careful and spend a lot of time thinking about the nature of the relationship between law enforcement and crime, okay? And then the other thing is, who's making the laws that these people that are hired to enforce, who's making these laws? In America, which is what we're talking about, because it's the country that has developed this drug policy that's so controversial. The people who rule this country have always understood. It goes back to the founding fathers and how they looked at Rousseau and John Locke and the philosophers that they derived their ideas about what America was going to be. And it was going to be a republic. And it was going to be a republic ruled by propertied white men who were educated. And they understood that they would have to use as much force to control the rabble as any divine monarch. But they wanted to do it. They had no illusions. They understood people to be basically thugs who need to be forced to be good. And that included themselves. So they had this philosophy that in their republic, the republic would be ruled with an iron fist by these elite landed people like Washington and Jefferson. And slowly, over time, and more and more laws were were developed in order to keep this republic, this group of rulers in control of the republic. Ultimately, the drug policy of this country evolves and serves the same purpose. The drug policy of this country is made by the same set of rulers who descend from those founding fathers. There are people that they know that they have to have, that people are going to commit crimes all the time, that the country and humanity is awash with crime, and that they have to rule their subjects with an iron fist. And drug law policy as it's evolved into the 21st century helps them to serve that ruling function. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And that's a very, very concise summary that doesn't even get into the fact that these rulers were first-rate criminals themselves. They had slaves. They enslaved people. They wiped out the indigenous population in this country, and they took their property. This group of rulers who believed in rationality had from the very beginning, as part of their design, the conquest of the North American continent. The 13 colonies were just the beginning, but even then, in 1776, Washington had been out to Ohio, and these people they knew the country, the continent was there, and they had planned eventually to conquer the whole thing. The Republic was always going to be an empire. They planned on conquering Canada and Mexico, and conquering all of South and Latin America. And that too is part of what it means to be an American. And as we see around the world, America pursuing this policy of 1,000 military bases around the world, of a CIA station in every country, subverting and sabotaging those governments for American corporations. It's all part of this, what it means to be an American, and drug policy serves that purpose also, not only of enforcing laws in the country, but also of enabling the American empire to expand globally.
Well, in that vein, my second question for you is, I would like you to explain how the business of opium and heroin played a part in the United States foreign policy involving China in the 1920s and 30s, sort of fast forward to that time period.
Well, yeah, I've sort of set the stage for that. As you know, America did expand through the 19th century to encompass the whole continent. And from the time the founding fathers developed this republic and started to, progress towards global domination, they were ready in 1776 to take on the English, and they took on the English and they won. They were ready to take on the French, and they were ready to take on the Spanish. The United States from its inception envisioned itself as a world power. And it just had to conquer the continent first, which it had done by 1900. And around 1900, it decided to go global. And it defeated the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. And started taking over Spain's colonies. It took over Cuba, and it took over the Philippines, among other places. So the Philippines was the first American campaign overseas. And it was devastating. And American forces did to the Filipinos what they had done to the American indigenous people. Wiped them out. And while they were there, in this initial foray into the Far East, they first really came in contact with opium. Now, knew a little bit about opium because Chinese immigrants had been bringing it into the country for about 50 years at that point. But when they got to the Philippines, they actually got in contact with the growers and the distributors firsthand. And like every other major power, the United States wanted to get a piece of China. And once they had their base in the Philippines, they were able to start commercial concerns and diplomatic relations with China. And all of a sudden, the United States, which wants to be a world player, finds itself competing with France and Germany and England and all the other colonial powers for a piece of China. And it's well aware from its time in the Philippines that opium is a very important commodity there. I'm sure your listeners know that the British fought 2 opium wars in China in the middle of the 19th century. The opium wars were to allow Great Britain to ship Indian opium and force it upon the Chinese and actually make them buy it. It was such a valuable commodity, and in exchange, the British got tea. So China was this huge, over-colonized country with immense resources, and the United States wanted a part of it. And within that context, opium was a very important commodity to be traded and controlled as a way of controlling the Chinese economy and its politics. At the same time, when the United States colonized the Philippines, the evangelical people, the missionaries who were in the Philippines, saw the destruction that opium addiction was doing in the Far East, and they wanted to wage a campaign against opium addiction, and they wanted to wipe out the opium trade, which led to what were called the Harrison narcotic laws in the United States, which were enacted in 1914. This is the beginning of the war on drugs. The importation of opium into the United States was regulated, not initially for health concerns, but as a revenue-raising measure so that the United States government could get a piece of the action. But very quickly, it was made a law enforcement issue because opium and its derivatives, morphine and heroin, and codeine, were thought to be detrimental to people. It became a law enforcement measure around 1920. And that's when the original Bureau of Narcotics was created within the Internal Revenue Service of the United States. And the United States actually began its war on drugs. So all of these things happen at the same time. The United States is entering China. It's trying to get a piece of the colonial action there. Opium is a big commodity that has an effect on the politics and the who's going to rule China. And at the same time, opium becomes illegal in the United States. Okay? So it's a tremendously complex situation. And in its wrangling against Great Britain and the Soviet Union and all the other countries, the United States had to back a particular faction in China. And the faction that it chose to back was the Kuomintang nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek. And what the United States started to do was to support Chiang Kai-shek, who was a Methodist, who had converted and become a Christian, was part of this event. He was beloved by the evangelicals. He was going to bring China into the American sphere against all the other colonial powers in China. And so he was the perfect candidate, and so stated American policy was to back Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang political party of the nationalist Chinese against the communists and all the other warlord factions. The only problem is that Chiang Kai-shek supported his regime on opium profits. That's where the problem with China in the 1920s and 30s begins. All of a sudden, America's ally in China becomes the biggest supplier of the mafia and the Jewish drug gangs that spring up in Prohibition. And when the Bureau of Narcotics figures this out in 1925, that it's the Kuomintang that's supplying Arnold Rothstein in New York, all of a sudden there's a big conflict. What do you do? And this becomes symbolic. It becomes not only symbolic, it is the essence of America's war on drugs for the next 100 years. Politically, the United States wants to support people who will advance its stated policies in China as the Kuomintang did in the 1920s and 30s. And at the same time, these people are often drug dealers. So the stated policy is to say, we're against drugs, and the unstated policy is to support people like Chiang Kai-shek who are drug dealers and to do it secretly. And to try to square law enforcement in the United States with this contradictory policy.
Right. That's just the most astounding part of this to me. And it continues forward from that time period. In fact, in the as it relates to Japan and World War II, I'm curious about that as well. How the drug is sort of storyline continues even on into the Second World War.
Okay, by 1933, when right after Japan and the famous rape of Nanking, Japan was another colonial power fresh on the scene that wanted a piece of China, along with all the other colonial powers. And Japan had carved out a little empire in Manchuria, where a lot of opium was grown. And they took over a big chunk of the illicit opium trade. They were Japanese and the Chinese were in some ways competitors. But at the same time, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang nationalist Chinese started working with the Japanese. And they were supposed to be fighting the Japanese. But because they were both dependent on opium, the intelligence service of the Kuomintang secretly worked through a guy named Du Yusheng, who was the opium crime lord in Shanghai. And they actually worked together in concert to make sure that they could profit mutually from the opium trade. And they formed vast underworld criminal organizations that were controlled by their intelligence services for the benefit of both. And the United States stood by and watched this. And it said nothing about it publicly. And it wasn't really a problem until the United States went to war with Japan. Now all of a sudden it had to try to separate out what this underworld relationship that the nationalist Chinese had with the Japanese, while protecting one ally against the enemy. And again, the only way they could really do this was to start developing an intelligence service of their own that was capable of working within foreign organized crime milieus. And so they formed the OSS, which is the predecessor of the CIA. And all around the globe, the OSS starts forming relationships with the organized crime syndicates that are not only running the drug trade, but are running every other criminal organization that goes around the world. Because the opium that the Chinese were sending to the United States always passed through Marseille, where the French underground converted it into heroin. And so the OSS started working with the Corsican and French underworld. It started working with the Japanese underworld. It started working with the Chinese underworld in order to track and control. It has to control because it has to be able to separate out America's stated allies and enemies from what's actually how they're actually working together in the underworld. And so you need an intelligence service to do this. And that's one of the reasons that the OSS is formed in World War II. Am I making this clear?
Oh, it is perfectly clear to me, sir.
Okay. All of a sudden, now that the United States is a world player and it emerges from World War II as the dominant power, it needs an intelligence service that can deal with organized crime units around the world to control, and we'll just stick to drug smuggling so that it can protect its clients overseas and pursue its enemies. It has to control the underworld drugs business in order to be able to do this for propaganda purposes back home, in order for the American people to believe what its stated policy, that it is adhering to its stated policies. It needs a secret intelligence service that can pursue the unstated policies of actually controlling underworld crime.
Right, and this explains the whole idea that the criminal organizations are completely intermingled with the intelligence organizations, the best known example being the CIA, of course, which, as you said, the OSS was the predecessor of. Many people have heard and know and have observed that the CIA has been involved in various levels of the drug trade. But many other departments of the United States government agencies were also involved in the opium and heroin business, even to this day, it seems.
Well, certainly, yes. And the military and the State Department are certainly, along with the Department of Justice, the three organizations that you have to look at apart from the CIA. They were all in existence long before the CIA. They were all in existence from 1790 or whatever it was that the country was created. The Department of State basically served as our CIA for the first 150 years up until the OSS and the CIA were organized, and it had within its, different embassies around the world, people who specialized in narcotics and were assigned to deal with the drug trade around the world. And they were supported by non-government organizations, the State Department, like the Foreign Policy Association, which I'm sure your listeners are aware of. These are groups of the Foreign Policy Association was formed by academics in the employ of corporations to do surveys around the world to find out where resources were that industry needed, and to do so apart from the State Department. And they would often hire secret agents to find out information and to bribe officials. And so these private organizations like the Foreign Policy Association, in conjunction with the CIA, with the State Department, function as a unofficial CIA for many, many years. And the people who form the CIA come out of them, but they're doing the same things. They're just doing it in a sense informally. And of course, the military, as it expands around the world, is also functioning in this way. It wants to find out, it's also interested in where the resources are that industry needs, and establishing bases close to the sources of those resources so that the United States industry can gain access to them. And the Justice Department serves to make all this legal. The rulers are saying at every step, you have to develop laws and create laws that enable the State Department and the corporations through its these kind of foreign policy association organizations and the military to do the things that we need to do overseas. So this whole a whole branch of law, international law, develops. At the same time, you have the law enforcement agencies within the United States which become involved. And those are the primarily customs, which is concerned with not allowing anything to be smuggled into the United States because it's a federal agency, and it makes sure that every kind of product that comes into the United States pays the required tariff. So customs doesn't want to see opium coming into the United States after it's made illegal. Only opium it wants to see coming into the country is opium that's going to pharmaceutical manufacturers that are going to then legally package it up into oxycodone for middle-class white women. And of course, the Coast Guard serving the same function, and originally the Coast Guard and customs are in the Treasury Department because they're serving this money-making function. And but that's where drug law enforcement has its origins, along with the Bureau of Narcotics, which, when it was created in 1919 or 20, and up until 1968, only had 300 agents. The most that were ever overseas were 5 or 10 or 15. So, from the very beginning, the law enforcement agencies don't have a lot to do with what's going on overseas. It's basically the military and the State Department and the Justice Department. Up until World War II, when the CIA gets involved, and then, of course, around 1968, when the Bureau of Narcotics is moved into the Department of Justice from the Department of Treasury, and the United States starts its full court press to become the dominant world figure.
It seems as though every tentacle of the giant sea monster seems to wash every other tentacle of the giant sea monster, if you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean, yes.
And it just continues unabated almost to cross-contaminate within itself.
Yes, and they actually, starting around 1968, they talk about cross-pollinization. It actually was a CIA term that was injected into the government lexicon in 1968 when it was decided to take, in the midst of the Vietnam War, to take the Bureau of Narcotics out of Treasury. It only had at that time 350 agents, 15 of whom were overseas. That's it. And they vastly increased it's the number of agents in the organization. And the number has been steadily increasing ever since. It went from 300 in 1968 to close to 2,000 by 1972. And at that same time, the number of agents who were overseas, federal drug agents, increased from 15 to probably close to 100. And it's just the beginning. Nowadays, there's 300 agents in Afghanistan alone. And the reason for this was that in 1968, 1965, 66, 67, 68, the 15 federal narcotic agents who were overseas started uncovering a lot of evidence that the CIA was controlling the drug business. They sent agents to Laos, and these federal narcotic agents saw that the CIA was running the whole business in Laos through Vang Pao. They were controlling the country's, Laos's opium fields. They were controlling the market in Huisai, in the Golden Triangle. And they're reporting this back to headquarters, and headquarters is telling Richard Nixon that the CIA is the biggest drug smuggler in the world, and it's subverting his campaign promise to restore law and order to the United States. And so once that revelation was made in 1970, once President Nixon found out that the CIA was the biggest drug smuggler in the world and responsible for most of the heroin that was coming into the United States, and there was an epidemic, heroin epidemic, and he had promised to end it, he decided the only way to solve this problem was to put the CIA in charge of overseas drug law enforcement. And that's what happened. Every agent that the DEA, and the DEA is formed 3 years later in 1973, every agent that any DEA officer recruits and runs overseas has to be vetted and approved by the CIA to make sure that agent isn't going to sink somebody like Vang Pao in Laos, who's our client and who's fighting communism on our behalf. And so from that time forward, the CIA has controlled drug law enforcement overseas, and the DEA has served as its handmaiden for the simple purposes what we've been talking about all along, to maintain the fiction of a stated policy so that Americans will never know that the unstated policy is that the CIA is controlling the drug underworld.
That's a really good point. I'm going to move along to something else here, because I have an interesting sort of A to B to C discussion to ask you about. And that is that the Vietnam conflict is directly related in some ways by mechanism and by agency, certainly, to the Iran-Contra scandal. And, even that completely relates to the war on terror. I am often told that this is kind of a catch-all sort of idea of mine, but I do believe that Vietnam can be drawn directly to the Iran-Contra situation, and then again directly to the war on terror, specifically Afghanistan.
Well, sure. And it's all part of the same thing. It's exactly what I'm telling you. And once you see clearly the hidden hand of the CIA in all these things, it becomes perfectly clear why these things are happening. And The problem is that nobody talks about the CIA because it's against the law. One of the laws that your rulers imposed upon you was that it's illegal to name CIA officers. So nobody in the press can say this particular CIA officer in Langley or in this country is moving drugs around the world. You can't do it. It's against the law. And if you say it, you'll end up like Edward Snowden hiding in Russia, or any of the other people or like Bradley Chelsea Manning. You'll end up in prison for 30 years because you'll be revealing what's known as a national security secret. And the biggest reason for national security laws is to cover the criminal wrongdoing of agencies of the United States government across the board. And I don't know, it's obvious. It's just, this is just what's happening. But that's the way it is. And if you reveal the truth, if you were to reveal the truth, you would go to jail.
Right. If you ever notice that you're not specifically, no one is allowed to name any active or recently active agent of the CIA, anyone who is a contractor or any other sort of asset of the CIA. These things are directly punishable for going to jail for any average citizen to participate in. But it is worthwhile to note that the patterns don't seem to change, and we do have the same agency running through the entire history of this sort of drug trafficking sort of war, which we were told was a war on drugs domestically, but in reality is sort of a war conducted, fueled by, and in fact served entirely to sort of prop up, to support this agency and the continuation of the entire systemic problem.
Well, let's get back to what I was saying to you in the beginning. The reason that we have this policy of a stated policy in which we're fighting a war on drugs and an unstated policy in which we're controlling the world's drug organizations, illicit drug organizations, is to advance the American empire and to assure that the United States will dominate the world. This is the reason why it's happening. And it's, as I was saying to you at the beginning, it's what our founding fathers envisioned. And our founding fathers were slave owners. And they exterminated the indigenous American peoples. They have no problems enslaving you. They have no problem wiping you out. They have no problem bombing Libya or subverting Syria, killing 5 million people in Indochina. They have no problem, your rulers, controlling the Golden Triangle and doing it secretly, even though every reporter in the New York Times knew what was going on and kept their mouths shut. This is what America is. And it only seems illogical if you don't understand that it's virtually a cult of death and has been since its inception. And it's just doing what it always wanted to do and always planned to do. And it's doing it the way it always did it. It didn't say, we're doing this for good. In the Declaration of Independence, they talk about wiping out the savages. In the Constitution of the United States, originally, blacks are called 3/5 of a person, and slavery is legal. It only seems illogical if you have some fantasy about what this country's really about. It only seems illogical or strange if you believe the stated policy. It's just happening everywhere, all the time, every day. And it's for real.
And meanwhile, we have a policy which is public, which supports the large pharmaceutical companies and their use of the same illicit products. As you said, it's permissible to utilize opium for their purposes, for their money machines. But the idea...
Yeah. And from the time opium was made illegal and regulated, starting around 1914, 1915, the pharmaceutical industry became one of the blue chips. It's one of the most profitable industries that people can invest in. And it has been every year. The pharmaceutical industry makes money every year for its investors. And it doesn't matter how many stupid pills it produces. If you watch TV at night, every commercial tells you about a drug that can solve a problem for you. And then they tell you about the contraindications. Can be fatal. Can cause liver damage. They go on for 30 minutes, tell you about all the horrible things can happen, and people go out and buy these drugs anyway. Everywhere you look in the country, advertising for drugs is everywhere. All sorts of drugs. Millions of kinds of drugs. And the pharmaceutical industry it's all based on the control of opiates. That's the whole foundation stone for it, is the regulation of opiates. I mean, that's one of the reasons that marijuana was made illegal in 1936. It wasn't illegal until 1936. A lot of drugs weren't illegal. They were made illegal so that corporations could make money and so that your rulers would have another pretext for putting you in jail and controlling your behavior. And that's the only reasons it exists.
Well, thus the concept of the controlled substance, basically. Because, yeah.
Yeah, they tried it with booze and the people had a revolution. But, the people in the United States are drugged out, man. They like their drugs, all sorts of kinds of drugs.
Oh, that's for sure. I mean, it is prevalent in the food supply at this point. There are many chemicals which are drugs or drug substitutes in one way or another, ranging from caffeine to the various components of artificial sweeteners and things like this. But the pharmaceutical industry in the sick care industry definitely is one of the primary money makers there. But I do believe,
and one of the ways they construct it is by making drug policy a matter of law enforcement rather than public health. It's an anti-humanistic policy. The policy of the United States, in which drug control is a law enforcement issue rather than a public health issue, is the problem. It doesn't have to be a law enforcement issue. It can be a public health issue. There doesn't have to be criminal penalties for having drugs that aren't prescribed to you, or by classifying drugs like possession of crack cocaine as a mandatory 10-year first offense sentence. These things could be public health issues and solutions to these problems, where a person goes to rehab, not prison. But our rulers have made it a law enforcement issue because the rulers themselves do not go to prison when they get caught with drugs. Only poor people do. People who can't afford lawyers. People who are targeted because they're black or they're Latino or can't afford a lawyer. those are the people that go to prison, and that prisons are packed to overflowing with it. It's basically the new Jim Crow laws, drug laws.
Right.
It's part of the dark, evil soul that really defines our rulers. The rulers who would go off and kill 5 million people in Indochina and never think twice about it and wipe it from the history books. These are the people that are in control of our society.
It is really notable that, the crime of, let's just say you or I were to kill a single person, we would probably spend the rest of our lives in jail. We might even suffer the death penalty in some states, but the individuals who conspire to essentially kill thousands, millions, hundreds of millions are never punished. Well, sort of like the shoplifter who steals a loaf of bread may actually go to jail for a few days, but the individual who starves to death other people by other means, all sorts of means and mechanisms, they don't suffer the jail time or the punishment beyond, say, fines usually.
Well, that's why I began our conversation tonight by explaining to you that law enforcement doesn't follow the laws, it enforces them. That the rulers have these agencies, the CIA, the DEA, the FBI, Customs, the Justice Department, State Department, the military, enforcing its laws, whether they're international or domestic. But none of them are required to follow these laws. That's the point I'm trying to make to you, that all the agencies of our government are all breaking every law that you're required to follow by enforcing them. We're so there's so many laws for so many things, and all those laws exist targeted at you, not the rulers and not its enforcement agencies. Cops do not follow the laws. They enforce them. And so you have to be very careful when talking about the law and talking about crime. Our founding fathers are the people who created this whole notion of what this country is, wanted it to rule the world. And they knew the only way they could control the world was through brute force. And the agencies that it has working for it are that brute right-hand force. That's all they are, to keep you in place so they can rule. It has nothing to do with right and wrong. It has nothing to do with somehow we're better than them. It's just brute force.
I'm curious, Doug, what is it that caused you to begin to look into this personally? Because you have written a great volume of work on it. And I was wondering what actually got you started.
Well, my father had been a prisoner of war in World War II. And he was in a camp in the Philippines, a Japanese camp in the Philippines. And he was the only American, and there were 120 Australians and 44 Brits. And a British major was in control of this place, of this camp. And this British major made a deal with the Japanese. In exchange for him, the British major getting control of discipline in this prison camp, he assured the Japanese there would be no prison escapes. And so they didn't want to have to watch the whole camp and it's do all sorts of, they passed it off on him for this deal. And in exchange, the British major gave the 44 British soldiers easier jobs than the 120 Australians who got all the hard work. He was able to, he became the ruler, and he supported his minority over a majority. So what happened was, 4 Australians broke out of camp. They were captured and brought back to camp and executed. And the next day, the Australians had a war council, and they drew straws, and a couple of the Australians snuck into the major's house at night and killed him. And my father got one of the short straws, and he had to stand watch. And so he was in big trouble when the camp got liberated. There'd been a mutiny, a revolution in this camp. And once the camp was liberated, the authorities, the American and Australian authorities, didn't know how to handle it. And so they covered it up. They said this camp never existed. They gave my father a false war record. Sent him out to put him back in the Philippines for about another 6 months and then sent him home. So I was curious to know what other kinds of things like this happened. And that's when I got into writing about the Phoenix program. I heard about the Phoenix program in Vietnam and decided to write about that. And that was my second book. The CIA in Vietnam created what was called the Phoenix program, which is the model for the war on terror. They wanted to, they realized around 1967 that the war wasn't going well. And the reason it wasn't going well is because the Vietnamese had a secret government, their own little shadow government, the National Liberation Front. Secret agents inside Vietnam who were administering the insurgency. And they were all civilians. They weren't soldiers. And so the CIA created the Phoenix program to identify them and kill them all. It'd sort of be like the Democrats killing off all the Republicans in the United States or something like that. And then I found out that basically the CIA has a Phoenix program in every conflict around the world. I had a Phoenix program in Afghanistan. There's a Phoenix program in Iraq. It has a worldwide Phoenix program called, the War on Terror, which is just to kidnap people, deprive them of their rights to due process, and kill them. And that's what our country does. And you never hear about it, because if you talk about it, you're revealing national security secrets and you go to jail for the rest of your life.
Right. I find it interesting that your father's war record was altered, etc., to cover things up. My father actually was someone who served in Vietnam, and at this point in time, there is absolutely no record in existence for him.
Yeah, well, it's just standard policy, They actually have a term for it. They call it cheap dipping. Mm-hmm. And it happens all the time. But you can't say anything about it, because it's a secret.
Right. They disappear these records or alter them to leave evidence of various things. They sort of rewrite the story afterwards. Quite
Sometimes
often.
they rewrite it before. You'd be surprised. I mean, people talk about the release of these documents, for example. All the documents that supposedly are coming forward, telling us all sorts of things that we don't know. Most of those documents are miniature scripts that are written for a play, which just confirms the stated policy and really very, very rarely gets into anything of any importance. None of the national security documents that are coming out from Snowden through Greenwald are telling us anything we don't know about anybody we don't know already exists. We're not learning anything about the criminal enterprises of the CIA around the world. We're not learning anything about it. You're hearing more about it from me right now.
Right. The documentation is often more misleading than even the official fiction. It seems.
Almost every document that the government produces is a fiction. They don't write down the good stuff.
Well, by good stuff, you mean the truth, I think.
If you think that you know what's going on in the National Security Council and the things that they're cooking up over at Halliburton and Chevron, please tell me. But I have a funny feeling nobody will ever see those documents.
Or at least not the documents that would lead us to the truth, that's for sure.
Right.
Right. But the official fictions are often on display, and as a matter of fact, you don't even have to go through the trouble of going to the National Archives and et cetera, et cetera. You could just, at this point, go to any mainstream media site or pick up some electronic copy of a newspaper, and you'll certainly get that easily, I think, now.
Listen, I have friends that go to the National Security Archives, the National Archives, looking for records about the Bureau of Narcotics. And they go there and they get a memo that some guy wrote. Let's say Jack Cusack, who was in charge of the Bureau of Narcotics Foreign Operations in 1967. And he writes a memo. And in that memo it says, have discovered that drugs are coming out of Laos and are going to Thailand, and from Thailand they're going to the Viet Cong in Cambodia. Nowhere. Because Jack Cusack at the time was the Bureau of Narcotic agent who was covering for the CIA in the Bureau of Narcotics. So why would he ever write an official memo blowing their cover? That's why I'm saying these documents are all. Also, any document that you're going to find written by any official from the United States government is not going to reveal anything that's not supposed to be revealed, and it's not going to go to the National Archives if it does. Because these organizations understand that they work for the rulers and that they're not allowed, and that they're covering up for them. So they don't write this stuff in their documents. You just don't see it. It just doesn't happen.
Right. The reality is certainly not represented therein. You get the hint of a reality once in a while, but that is generally a mistake.
Right. Everybody knows in government that you're not going to get promoted if you write in a memo, the CIA is dealing drugs in this country, or the CIA is doing this, or the State Department is doing that. Bradley Chelsea Manning got sent to prison for life because he revealed a video that showed American helicopter gunship pilots shooting civilians. Well, every soldier in Iraq knows that happened every day. Every reporter in Iraq knew that was happening every day around the country. But nobody was going to put it in a report. Nobody was going to reveal it. The press knew better than to reveal it. Bradley Manning reveals it once and he goes to jail for 30 years for the rest of his life. That's the reality of revealing that our government is a criminal organization.
Mm.
If people in the military were revealing every war crime that was committed, which they're legally required to do, there would be no other room in the newspapers for to report anything else.
Right. It is so numerous and institutional that it is absolutely beyond count, beyond anyone's ability to represent reasonably anywhere, I think. But what you have done here is given us the beginnings the ability to look at least one facet of that sort of intermingled criminal enterprise that is being conducted in all of our names.
Everywhere, and let me give you another example. While we were talking about my father, when I was about 19, I was working in Pleasantville, New York, where I had grown up, and it was the summer, and I was working for a tree company, climbing trees, and in the morning, I would have breakfast at the Rome restaurant in Pleasantville, New York. My father at the time worked at the post office, and he worked the night shift. And when he was getting off the night shift, he would go to the Rome restaurant for his breakfast. And we would meet there together. And he would sit with the adult men who were rooting for Johnny Unitas and the Baltimore Colts. And I'd sit with the young guys who were rooting for Joe Namath and the Jets. And we didn't really have much to do with each other. It's like 1968, 1969. And one morning my father says to me, we meet at the cash register and walk outside together, and he says, I want you to meet me here tomorrow morning an hour early. Meet me up by the bank. Park up by the bank, and we're going to walk here. I want to show you something. So I did what he said. And the next morning I meet my father, and we walk like 2 blocks, and we get to turn the corner where the Rome restaurant is. There's no cars on the street. There's just the Pellegrino bakery truck and the car that Nick the Greek owns. Nick the Greek is the guy who owns and runs the Rome restaurant. We walk into the street. I follow my father. He walks up behind the bakery truck and he throws open the back doors. And inside, Nick the Greek sitting in the shotgun, the Pellegrino bakery truck driver, and 4 Pleasantville cops, policemen. And they're all sitting there exchanging numbers and money. The cops in Pleasantville had the job of picking up the numbers as they walked around town. Nick was the bookie, and they're handing the money and the receipts to the mafia guy who's in the Pellegrino bakery truck. And my father throws open the doors, and the 2 of us are standing there looking at these 4 cops, all of whom I know. I go to school with their kids. I've known them all my life. I know Nick the Greek. I don't know the bakery truck driver. And their mouths are hanging open. And my father says, Dougie, this is the true relationship, the nature of crime and law enforcement. And he closes the doors. Well, nothing ever came of it. I went back for breakfast the next day. Nobody said a thing. There was no repercussions. Now all of a sudden I just knew what most everybody else in town already knew. Everybody who played the numbers. That there really is no difference between crime and law enforcement. One serves the other. They're both involved in the same thing together. And they do so with the approbation of the powers that be. Because the people in the establishment, George Bush, Bill Clinton, are the biggest criminals of all. And everybody knows it. It's just, you have to just open your eyes and you can see where it goes on every day in every way. And the only thing that really matters is that whether or not you see it or not. But even if you see it, what difference does it make? How are you going to change the nature of humanity, of what it means to be a human being, which is the powerful lord it over the less powerful, and everybody's involved in crime? I mean, this is the way our society and our world are organized.
True, and I think your father was rather brilliant to sort of shock you with that very real image of looking at what is in your own town, what is right before your own eyes on a daily basis. And look, this is truly the way of the world, Doug. And that is really a brilliant thing that I think your father did there.
Well, yeah, but how many people in Pleasantville stumbled through their lives and never understood that? They looked at these cops and they thought, he's my protector. Not the guy who's picking up the numbers and working with the mafia, the same people he's supposed to be putting in jail, you know? That's the way it is. And you can stumble through life and you can believe that the cops are the good guys. There to protect you. But it just ain't so.
Right. It's very symbiotic, really. And the larger the stakes and the larger the possibilities of gain, or even whether it is power or financial gain, or however it is you want to sort of gauge it, the larger the gains, I guess, the larger the players and the larger the armies of players, it seems.
That's exactly right, you know. And with drug dealing, the FBI wouldn't get involved at first through the reign of J. Edgar Hoover, because Hoover said it was a consensual crime and that anybody who got involved in drug law enforcement would get corrupted. And he didn't want his FBI agents to be corrupted. Because in order to enforce drug laws, drug agents have to go undercover. They have to misrepresent themselves. They have to say, either I'm a drug seller or I'm a drug buyer, and insinuate themselves into a consensual relationship under false pretenses. Sometimes they have to pretend to be a drug seller or a drug buyer for weeks and weeks and months. They have to actually join into the criminal milieu, function as a criminal. They have to buy drugs and sell drugs in order to ingratiate themselves with the criminal milieu. They have to be able to hang up their morality on a coat hanger every morning and lie, steal, and cheat in order to do their job every day. And then they're supposed to come home at the end of the day and they're supposed to put their morality back on like it's a coat. But it doesn't happen, because in the drug business, having to deal with the drug traffickers, become part of them, one of them, eventually the criminal conduct that you copy and adopt as your own becomes you. And lying and stealing and cheating becomes part of your ethic. And it becomes part of what you do in your business dealings with everybody else and in the bureaucracy. Which is why the drug law enforcement agencies, the DEA, the CIA, the Customs, are packed with people who do nothing but lie, steal, and cheat the American public day in and day out, because they are part of this criminal milieu. And lying and stealing and cheating are what they do for a living. They have adopted all the characteristics of the criminals that they're supposedly hunting. In fact, they've become the biggest and the most predatory of the drug smugglers. And in terms of the FBI, they've become the biggest political criminals in the world, breaking in having informants in Muslim communities across the country. It's just incredible what they do. They've so adopted criminal behaviors that they've turned into absolute criminals themselves, and they can't ever recover their morality. They're gone. They're over the moon. They're irredeemable. And in order to become part of these organizations nowadays, the DEA or the CIA or the FBI, you have to go through years and years of indoctrination. You have to adopt the most fascist views that you could imagine. And you have to get security clearances, and you have to pass loyalty oaths in order that you'll never ever tell all the criminal things that they're doing. And in fact, you have to love the criminal things that they're doing and buy into it totally. So we have these legions, hundreds and thousands of people who are protecting our rulers, who are nothing but paid crooks, gangsters, who are doing the most outrageous criminal things on a daily basis in the name of America. And that's a fact.
It's what I like to refer to as the method actor syndrome, because once one immerses themselves into a role far enough as a method actor, they sometimes lose themselves within the role, and therefore...
Yeah, Kurt Vonnegut said, be careful what you pretend to be. Someday you're going to wake up and be it. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's what's happened. And the bureaucrats who control the law enforcement agencies that we're talking about have adopted, have worked this system in the last 60 years since World War II. They've perfected it to creating these guys who are so indoctrinated that they'll never give it up. I mean, now, and it's part of our education system. It's part of the major media. You don't hear it. They speak with one voice. You know, it's like bad Putin. You know, there's actually absolutely no objectivity. There's no self-reflection. It's all just a script that's written that people know how to follow.
Right, and even seemingly opposite sides of that equation, seemingly totally juxtaposed sides of that script, are actually supporting the same agenda from whatever angle you wish. It does seem
it's a battle amongst the rulers. It's not a battle amongst the people.
Oh, absolutely. I had Kurt Vonnegut in mind, actually. It was funny you brought him up when I said it's that method actor syndrome.
So, can you just ask me one more question to sum up?
Well, you know, there are so many things I would like to ask you, but, I think we've covered this pretty well, and I don't want to get off into too much more of a tangent with you. I would like you to talk about the books that I mentioned. Also, I did mention your interest in poetry as well.
Yeah. I just had I edited an anthology called With Our Eyes Wide Open, Poems of the New American Century. It was published 2 weeks ago. It just came out from West End Press. About a year and a half ago, 16 months ago, I got the idea that I would get poets from around the world and ask them each to submit a couple of poems, which I selected pretty much one from each of 75 poets, 38 from outside the country, 38 are Americans of various ethnicities and genders and stuff, and just poems about the realities of life in the 21st century. And it's being pretty well received. If you like poetry, check it out. If you like politics, check it out. It's all political poetry.
Oh, right. I recognize that. I used to write song lyrics and poems myself, and as you can see, I'm politically minded, and that's why I wanted to make sure to mention it. I know it wasn't really part of the discussion today, but that anthology.
Can I interrupt you, Chuck, for a second?
Sure.
The reason I went with poetry is because I've been writing books, for 30 years. And I was frustrated because no matter how many books I wrote and how direct I was in talking about the corruption and criminal activities of the government and its agencies, the government has always, and its people in the press have always been pretty much able to pour cold water on anything I say, or just ignore it and it goes away. It's hard to fight propaganda with factual prose. And I was wondering, maybe poetry might work better. Maybe if I had 75 poets speaking poetically with beautiful words maybe it would be easier for people to see the four cops and the two mafia guys in the bakery truck, which is right in front of them. Maybe it would be easier to see through all the cover-ups if poets were speaking truth to them. And I think to some extent that's true. That if you read this poetry, you connect with something that's very human. Something in a way that prose isn't able to do. Once every couple of pages, if he's a good writer, you get a sense of poetry and something hits you in a poetic way. But in this anthology of poems with our eyes wide open, every page hits you right between the eyes. It tells you something about what it means to be a human being and to be a person in the world nowadays without, a veil of propaganda or doublespeak. It's just direct language. And so I'll encourage people, even if you don't get this book, to look for speech that gets at what it means to be a human being and not the kind of propaganda that you see on TV all day. MSNBC, Fox News, talk shows. Try to get a little bit deeper into things, look a little deeper into things and connect with other people of other nationalities, other races, and find out, search with them to find your common humanity. Because it's only by us connecting each other on this really human level that there's going to be any hope that we can counteract the psychological warfare that our rulers are waging against us. Individually, to connect with other people is the only way you can do it.
Right, and scholarly writing is one thing, as you say, but sometimes the lyrical composition, whether it be through music or through poetic expression, or even in painting sometimes, creates a more relatable sort of experience that people can share.
It's a way to break through,
Right.
And unless you're walking around with your eyes wide open all the time, and nobody can, we all get tired. The poetry anthology is something you can pick up at any point and get a jolt and get back to reality. What it means to be a person.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, I believe that is the most important thing that we can say, which is that we need to begin to get back to being people instead of simply being just
Americans or something like, some division of people.
Whatever division or compartment you might want to apply to yourself. These are labels useful to others, not to us as people.
Exactly.
So this is always good food for thought. Doug, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. And is there anything that you'd like to add besides, sir?
No, I just hope that it's been a valuable 90 minutes for your listeners.
Wow.
I know that I was trying to capsulize some very big subjects in a way that tied them together, and I hope I succeeded to some extent.
Well, you certainly did for me, and I really appreciate it again. And, the Phoenix program and all of these works that Mr. Valentine has produced, and even that poetry anthology, which I must confess I have not read, but it does sound like something I'm going to have to read, Doug.
Well, thank you. I hope you enjoy it.
I sure will, as someone who appreciates that as an art form to begin with, and also all art forms which are, in a way for me, they are the real sort of shock, shock troops that end up in the battlefield of the mind, these types of presentations. So that is extremely useful, and I can't thank you enough. And anytime that you want to rejoin me, Doug, and do another one of these, I'd be more than happy, and we could cover probably 100 subjects with you, though today we did focus on the truth about the war on drugs.
Okay, I'd be glad to do it.
Thank you, sir. And
okay.
You have
Adios.
Have a good night now. My goodness, can I have any more technical problems today? So anyway, that was Doug Valentine, and he's the author and really the key source for me on the war on drugs and the evolution, the history of the Phoenix program and the various types of Phoenix programs that have existed virtually since the inception of our nation in one way or another, and also, the background history which is contained in there, which we did not even begin to discuss, about the British Empire and their opium wars, etc., etc. So, let's see, we have just a little over 30 minutes left, and I may get into some other topics here unless you guys want to join me and discuss what Doug and I were discussing. If anybody else wants to jump in and discuss anything else, I'm sure this was somewhat thought-provoking for some of you. For me, this is sort of revisiting old territory, but I always find it instructive to go back and sort of talk to some of the guys who thought about this and got into it and really produced a lot of work to try and enlighten all of us in one way or another by adding to the overall discourse on various topics. So anyway, what else do I have for tonight? Let's see, I think I have the phones up, by the way, which is, of course, 718-717. I always forget that number. And, of course, I'm tossing things around over here. I also have some other pages on some other topics here. I got a few messages, a few complaints, and I'm laughing at most of it. But anyway, 8296. That's what it was. Okay. 718-717-8296, or if you have me or UCY Radio on your friends list, you can drop in as well if you like. If not, I'm just going to ramble on for about the next 25 or so. And, I'm not sure what the hell happened at the beginning of the show there, because it was telling me that there was some sort of a problem with connecting the call. And then next thing I knew is it was a couple of minutes deep. So I got to apologize for that at the beginning of the show, of course. And then, just hitting the wrong thing when you're going to do something else, ended up, killing me there when I was talking to Doug, and I had dropped off there for about another 30 seconds. But this is how we have fun when it's live, right? So, I was, discussing a bunch of things earlier today, and I got really lost on some of this, drug war history and, war on drugs, drug war history. It's interesting to note, though, that the real significant changes after the policies that had sort of gotten us through, World War II and Korea, which we didn't even touch on Korea, with Doug tonight. But, it's interesting to note that the massive change in the drug policy sort of occurred as the sentiment on the Vietnam War was shifting, as many more troops were coming back to this country, quite addicted to heroin, of course, because it was so abundant and cheap there, right there. In fact, the sort of intel agency's support of all of these, not what we would call cartels today, but really in Vietnam they were farmers. And the gangsters who sort of ended up intimidating, ruling over, controlling those farmers is definitely worth noting as well. And I tied this together, of course, with the later, sort of interactions with our government agencies and, the South American death squads and all that other fun stuff, except, of course, you'll notice that the trends which, sort of became the localized epidemics in this country, realistically run parallel right along with the wars. If you notice the sort of, looseness and chaotic, nature of the drug culture, the illicit drug culture, in this country was sort of scattered until the Vietnam War was really ramped up in the mid-60s. Then all of a sudden, as our troops and as the intelligence agencies had begun to harness, the Golden Triangle and all of that, then, of course, there became an inner city sort of contained heroin epidemic, which spread like wildfire. This, of course, also leads us to understand that, there's all of these methadone clinics and treatment centers, which weren't really doing these guys a whole lot of good back then, I can assure you, that sprung up all over the place. And if you take a look at the people that actually propagated that stuff all over, and the people that still to this day are making money off of the local methadone clinics, which are pretty much kept out of sight and out of mind in most communities, you'll find that that sort of walks hand in hand with that heroin epidemic. It's also not an insane notion to realize that heroin was created by a company which had also sort of created it to deal with. Because see, methadone was created to deal with heroin. Heroin was created to deal with the morphine addicts, and so on and so on. They always seem to give us a new poison to fight the old poison, and the greatest poisons are generally the most prolific and well supported by the agencies. So the fun part there is that Vietnam gave us the rise of a very serious urban epidemic of this type. Then when you then look forward into the post-LBJ era, where we had Richard Nixon declaring and sort of trying to screw around with the agencies and trying to change the drug policy. Of course, this is a very surface view, because after all, he was ramping up drug enforcement domestically. But even though he did attempt to do some sort of battle with the larger international agencies, he was not able to get his hands around them. And since they had just so very recently shot so many people in the head, it was time to extricate Mr. Nixon from any sort of possibility of constitutional power by using, of course, former, and there's no such thing as former, but let's be honest, CIA agents that sat there and pretty much, backstabbed him during the entire Watergate situation. I advise you to read a book called Secret Agenda, which will explain to you a little better about how guys who were masters of black ops made mistakes that you or I would not have made regardless of our training. During black bag operations that were supposed to be done domestically, quietly, that were supposed to be these sort of domestic political issues that were out of control. And, Richard Nixon is the madman. Richard Nixon is the bad guy. But, if you put him in his proper context, he's no more of a gangster than any of the rest of them. It's just that he got caught because he got set up, because they wanted him out of the way, because he was turning around and doing what? He was actually trying to stand up to the agency, and I pretty much think he was the last guy to really do that. Of course, the last guy to actually attempt to get his hands around that serpent was JFK, and, well, we know what happened to him. And, of course, RFK probably would have threatened to do the same, so there was no way he was going to be allowed to survive either. Anyhow, I know. I correlate every damn thing to the JFK assassination. But back to my point about the drug epidemics and how they run very parallel with the incursions into foreign nations, the agencies and the militaries having put all their boots on the ground in particular areas and exploiting what would probably only be very localized drug problems and making them international drug problems. Of course, when you go a little further into the 1970s, we again have a sort of a shift in the drug policy, because after the mid-70s there was no more Vietnam War, and after we fully extricated ourselves from there, well, some of the command and control of the drug enterprises were no longer allowed to conduct themselves so freely and easily and catch themselves free rides and free planes and have free shipments. So therefore, because the military was not useful and, in that area of the world could no longer be exploited, you see a slight downturn in the drug culture for a little bit in the late 70s. But right away, we have it being picked up, but this time by a different drug epidemic. They call it epidemic. I hate the word, because it's only epidemic when everybody starts to see it on their front doorstep. They don't really care if it's absolutely devastating communities that they don't have to lay their eyes on generally. But the epidemics of drugs had continued onward, forward, and this time cocaine, of course, became the rising sort of punishable offense among all of us in the lower classes, among all of us who did not have the advantages, let's just say, of the elites and of those in the know and those in power, those even in the smallest of political powers. All of a sudden there was an inundation of cocaine. And then, of course, the greater and sort of poor man's version of that rather expensive drug, which was crack cocaine. And, of course, we do know about, now let's just bring him up again. We know about Mike Rupert's efforts there. We know about Gary Webb's efforts there. We know about all of this kind of stuff. But what is lost here is, how is it, because, I always found it really fascinating in like movies like New Jack City, they would say stuff like, well, there aren't no Uzis made in Harlem, and not one of us in here owns a poppy field. Well, isn't that about as much truth as you can handle? These things get into this country. They're not even created in this country, and they get all over the world into places where they could not possibly be grown or cultivated or refined. And, you turn around and you look and you want to blame the people that are using it. But meanwhile, a lot of people don't even bother to look at the mechanism by which it travels internationally, globally. So, of course, while we're sitting there watching the rise of cocaine domestically in this country, what do we have going on? Well, we're supporting the death squads in South America, where cocaine is very easy to grow, isn't it? Right along with the coffee. Of course, in areas like Colombia and Panama and Chile and, I don't even know how many other places I could name right away. But in all of these South American nations, which again are out of sight and out of mind to most Americans, there were these supported death squads and freedom fighters, quote, end quote, in the air. And there were all of these sort of intrigues that wound up leading us to guys like Oliver North and taking a look at, the answers from people who were supposed to be in charge of these agencies, where they can't seem to remember a single thing that actually happened, or exactly how all of these, exchanges for weapons and drugs and trafficking and the ignorance of the continuous genocide of local populations and, the Major Max sort of characters down there that were sitting there punishing anyone who seemed to even blink the wrong way. And being a foreigner or being the press, an agent of legitimate journalism in those countries, would often get you killed. And of course we hear the stories about nuns being buried alive or raped or whatever else, but we never do really hear about the absolute brutality that was visited upon the entirety of the local populations, the actual terrorism, the actual atmosphere of fear and loathing, and the cult of death, which was quite honestly propped up financially, militarily, and also in a business sense by giving them plenty of customers for their local crops. So of course we watch the rise of cocaine in this country, and then we see the rise of crack cocaine, which is a lot easier to transport, and you can turn pure cocaine into a lot of smaller amounts of crack cocaine, and then it's just a whole lot more palatable for the poor population to be able to pick it up a few dollars at a time, as opposed to buying large amounts and getting themselves plenty of stuff they can put up their nose. Now it's easier to deal with, and hey, guess what else? You can also make plenty of money for the cigarette lighter companies and all of that. And then you've got, that introduces business into the local communities, doesn't it? Because you got to buy your glass pipes and your disposable lighters somewhere, don't you? See, they did you a favor. So anyway, that's the mid 80s. And then when that all blew up, where do we go back to? Well, it just seems to me like there was a little bit of a float there, and then there was the rise of the, what I would call the designer drug era, where we had stuff like ecstasy introduced and all of these other wonderful things, where people were sitting there and sort of, utilizing the more mainstream pharmaceutical models for creating their highs. And, then they started using stuff like, what was that called? Cat tranquilizer, Special K, and all that. So it almost became a homemade culture. So now you're making your bathtub gin because of the prohibition, or at least the temporary cessation of the problem, because after all, there was now too much light being shed on the South American cocaine cartels. So after that debacle continues for a little while, and plenty of people get themselves killed trying to make all sort of drug cocktails out of things under their sink, and augmenting what Big Pharma gives them to work with, which, by the way, if you even have the slightest condition, you can find yourself plenty of mind-altering, mood-altering, damaging forms of petroleum that you can ingest all sorts of different fun ways. You can go and get that, and it becomes more of a domestic issue, and drug use actually falls. Meanwhile, don't forget, I'm totally extracting one thing from this entire description, but I'll get to that in a minute. Alcohol, of course, is a continuous but well-taxed and acceptable, socially acceptable way of poisoning yourself. So therefore, that's not part of the equation, because I am talking about the illegal drugs, the so-called illicit drugs, the so-called bad drugs, if you will, mostly. So after that, then you start to see a little bit of an upswing in the desire once again for the cheap heroin imports toward the late 90s, and then, of course, exploding after 9/11. Well, why did it explode after 9/11? Afghanistan being the best sort of example of where one can find this, completely false dichotomy of drug enforcement and drug production and, these sort of legal remedies to the moral problem or legal remedies to the social problem as opposed to, social problems to the social problem. Then you see the rise again of heroin. And, not only, in synthetics, but all around heroin production increased, multiplied, and spread better than any virus I have ever seen in any daycare center. And nowadays we still are inundated with this. And why is that? Well, it seems to me to coincide once again with what our war machine is doing. So I thought it was very worth noting that Mr. Valentine has already studied a lot of this stuff, of course. So I was very glad to have him on. I'm sorry to you guys again for the little technical glitches, but I do what I can here. But all of this stuff wrapped up into a nice little nutshell. And if you go further back, believe it or not, you can find other parallels to other sort of drug cultures that were emerging in one way or another. They're directly proportionate, in fact, to the amount of military presence, the amount of agency presence that we inflict upon these other nations. And I say we as in the tentacles of the beast which are supposed to be under our control, which are clearly not. So, the one thing that is completely left out of the equation, and I sort of missed it there with Valentine, was that there was more than one concern about criminalizing marijuana. Of course, there was the textile concern, the hemp concern, as far as, being able to use it as a fuel, being able to use it as a textile, being able to use it for plenty of things. So, of course, there were business interests that needed to shut that down. And, of course, you can draw a direct arc between that and the reality of controlling a substance for the sake of propping up another substance, which seems to be the deal here. Because, after all, you could grow weed just about anywhere. I'm not saying you're going to grow the best quality weed wherever the hell you're sitting, but the fact is you can grow it just about anywhere. It's more difficult to produce some of these other addictive, damaging, painful, and in some cases completely toxic substances that are really not meant for you or I to ingest. But putting that aside, marijuana is the one thing that, although it's becoming a bit more fashionable to support drug decriminalization, I do take note every single time when these sort of increases in propaganda against it seem to begin to rise up. I was flipping through TV channels, what was it, just, I believe yesterday, I'm not sure because I really wasn't paying attention that much. But one thing that kept grabbing my attention is every time my remote would flip past what they call headline news, I was looking at yet another story of how bad marijuana and marijuana smokers, and one guy ate it, but how bad, all of these people that believe in decriminalizing pot are, and how it absolutely impairs you, and how it absolutely makes you make bad decisions, and how oh look, here's cases in Colorado where nobody cared about this and that, and here it is. See, the weed's not doing them any good in Colorado. The weed's not doing them any good in wherever else. Well, you know what that is, of course, is a new sort of swing to say, see, we're all better off without this drug. That's what they're trying to tell you, of course. But, if you buy that alcohol in any way is better for you, or the perfectly legal tobacco that they are pushing at this point, which is also, genetically modified or chemically altered and treated in every which way possible. If you think that that's any better for you than growing and drying and smoking another plant, really, I got a couple of bridges I could sell you. But But the reality is that they leave that out of the equation. And I do think it is worthwhile to measure the correlation between, the military incursions, the industrial, sort of incursions by the agencies, and all of these other things that just seem to, function supposedly on our behalf, supposedly in our interest, without ever once really considering the two-fisted approach, which it's not that the right hand and the left hand don't know what each other is doing. It's that they know perfectly well what each other is doing and that they are actually cooperating. I always find that most amazing when people try to pin it all on the ethnic organized crime families too. That's always a laugh for me, because you have the the sort of anti-vice kind of I don't know how to, the anti-vice social contract that everyone is supposed to adhere to and abide by and agree with, that, any sort of, pleasure industry of any kind is at the very least suspect or dark or evil, because it is, after all, criminal and, mob related or mafia related or firm related or whatever else. Well, I defy anyone to really go ahead and tell me what the actual difference is between the largest mob syndicates that you can think of, and I don't care about the ethnicity. It's not just because I have a vowel at the end of my name. It is because any of these criminal organizations, and I don't care if they're Asian or if they're Russian or if they're Italian or if they're Irish or if they're intermingled or unrealistically television family style, street gangs of interracial individuals that would never exist in any way, shape, or form in our tribal landscape. Okay, it doesn't really matter, because here's the thing. Those smaller organized crime groups don't really have the reach, resources, or the strength of what we now know as our government. So, if you think about it, really, the Italian mob, the five families, they're more like the pickpockets on the world stage that happen to pay a little tribute now and then to the real godfathers, who wear three-piece suits and supposed to be respectable and actually run the corporations that actually control everything on the ground. And it's not just the vice that they control, although they do enjoy controlling vice. Big Pharma, and taking a look at that kind of stuff, really does reveal to you, if you take an honest look at it, exactly how organized crime runs. I mean, what else do you call it when you intentionally kill people with things that you make? What else do you call it when you unjustly murder people you'll never even meet? What do you call it when you poison babies even before they take their first breath? Well, it sounds pretty evil to me, and it sounds pretty criminal to me, but realistically, these are just the big successful companies that we all know the names of, aren't they? So, I guess it's all a matter of perception, and I don't know, maybe I'm just crazy. So look, I'm very glad to be doing look at this. Anyway, I'm very glad to be doing the Tuesday and Thursday nights now here on UCY. Of course, I'm going to have Vince is going to come on after me with What Matters Worldwide. I'm not sure what he has planned. I'm going to carry the call for him, but that's that. I think Double Trouble Radio is on after that. I do forget who comes on after me there, but, this has been a lot of fun, even when you guys don't call in. Look, if I want to, I can just sit here and run my own mouth for 2 hours, but I don't know if you guys really want to hear that. So I'm not going to go after it. I got to say though that it is traveling further downstream, and it's not just the regular listeners that are picking up some of the stuff I'm doing. I've gotten some rather strange emails. Oh yeah. You can contact me through my Facebook page, which, is just my name on Facebook, even though it looks like they're screwing around with the posts lately a little bit. There's also an Ochelli Effect Facebook page. You can reach me via email if you like, although I'm noticing a lot of the people that I really like to talk to don't really want to deal with email anymore. I don't quite know what the point of that is, because I'm just assuming that they're listening to, reading, and understanding every single thing I do, and probably have my keystrokes logged in somewhere on some list, of troublemakers. Well, probably many lists of troublemakers that I'm on, and that's just fine. Because you know what? If you're not on a list of troublemakers somewhere, you're probably not somebody that I know anyway. But the thing is, if you do trust email, you can always email me at chuck1972 and get ready for the address, Lycos, LYCOS.com. I do read that stuff. I do pay attention to it. I am getting sick of certain notices dropping in my box, and I really wish that, some of these direct market emails would knock it the hell off, but I'm always happy to read something that looks original, and I don't really set a very high filter for my spam. Also, if you guys know me on Skype or you friend me on Skype, that's fine too. I can accept any contact, but I might cut some of them off. That does happen from time to time, although I haven't cut very many off. I do accept all friend requests on Facebook. Again, I don't necessarily keep every friend request, but I do accept them to start with and see what the hell they want to begin with, because I'm pretty much open to all new ideas, and hey, I do appreciate even criticism, so long as it's not overtly abusive. So that stuff is helpful to me. The Skype ID, if you wanted to find me, you just think, look, everybody calls me Chuck, but my name is Charles. So if you just go Charles . And then you remember how to spell my last name, Ochelli, then you can find me on Skype as well. So all of those things aside, those are the main ways that I take contacts. There is an Ochelli Effect website, but I haven't really been able to finish it yet because I'm just not that skilled. And plus, I've always got 100 other things to do. So that's not quite done, but that ought to be kind of interesting when that's ready to roll. Sometimes if you can't remember any of the other email addresses or whatever, you want to use an alternative email address, that works over there. So you could always write to chuck@theochellieffect.com. Yeah, I actually have that .com, but again, nothing published on it yet because it's all still in its rough draft phase. I don't know how long it's going to take me to finish it, but hopefully I'll get it done soon. Anyway, real quick before I do run out of time, I gotta say that the adventures with the Bundy Ranch and watching, listening to, and trying to sort of wrap my mind around the entirety of the situation over the past couple of weeks has been really fascinating. I'm not saying that I don't agree with what it is that they were out there doing, but then again, just like anybody else, you can find all sorts of flaws with the players in just about any of these sort of games that go on between government and individuals. And there are varying ways to look at this whole thing. I mean, is this a true issue of freedom, or is this just, one individual or one family of individuals who you wouldn't want to support in any sort of contest, actually being, part of a conflict that you don't want to get yourself involved in. But, I tend to think that if you take no position on this, or if you sort of take let me keep my own head covered and make sure that I don't make trouble, position on this, what are you doing? You might as well just go ahead and take a listen to, what Rachel Maddow was talking about a few days ago, where she did this entire show on all of these people that don't believe government exists, so therefore they're standing up against government because they don't believe it exists. Just so you know, that's the way that sort of wing of the media represents you and me and anybody who attempts to speak outside of the paradigm. It looks like I only have a minute left.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
See, but I have the files. You know, I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, that guy, how can that be possible? You know, days and the fondle slab of choice, I don't know that word, doesn't really matter. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from as long as it's real. It doesn't, it's hard to get real information. Because seriously, they don't want you to have these two sources whenever I try to prove out